So in this book, I've looked at philosophical, what is a way of describing, what is the essence of dharmic philosophy. And I wanted to capture as many schools of dharmic traditions, including Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, Vaishnava, Shaivite, Sri Aurobindo, many kinds of, as many as I could. And so that's one journey with internal opponents, because I write a lot of Sri Aurobindo's ideas to formulate what is dharmic civilization, then a Vaishnavite doesn't like it, some Buddhist says can't agree with it, and vice versa. So I spent a lot of my time of all these years making 4 trips a year to India, basically to churn with many people. And then on the other side, I would each version of what constitutes the distinctiveness of the dharmic civilization, I had to go and discuss with Western counterparts. And the same problem there, because the Catholic says this doesn't apply to me, Protestant has different idea, Eastern Orthodox Church, Jewish, many kinds of Jewish traditions. And then those who are not religious at all, the Western Enlightenment tradition, where I use Hegel as my kind of foundation for that. So this back and forth churning between one camp and the other, one civilization and the other, was very helpful for me, and I learned a lot. And I believe I found 4 or 5 major differences, which are each explained as a chapter in this book. And these differences met the test, like the difference I explained on history centrism, met the test that certain positions on the Dharma side, which are central principles that everybody accepts, despite all the differences among the Dharma, they'll all accept karma and reincarnation. They'll all accept karma and reincarnation as a premise. So I don't go too far in defining the Dharma very precisely, because the more precise you get, the more contentious it becomes. So I don't want to be too precise. I have to be sufficiently precise to differentiate it from the other side. And the karma reincarnation, I show in this book that if you use the Nicene Creed as your criteria of Christianity, because Nicene Creed, which talks about original sin, virgin birth, crucifixion, redemption, and so on, as the non-negotiable events in history without which you cannot qualify. The non-negotiable events in history. And the Nicene Creed was in the town of Nicaea, which is now in Turkey. I went and visited there just to get a feel of what the place was like. And it was Emperor Constantine in the 4th century where all these things happened, where the New Testament was constructed. So if you're looking for something that will be an approximation of a common creed for all Christians, because otherwise you keep arguing which Christianity you're talking about. Nicene Creed, Catholics require it as an article of faith. In fact, they recite the Nicene Creed in many events, and Protestants do. And you get Baptists, Southern Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, Episcopalians, whatever, and you will find that Nicene Creed is there. The exact version of Nicene Creed changes a little bit, but still there is a general pattern of historical events that are very unique and very absolute and mandated. So then I started saying, okay, what happens if one of the non-negotiables from the dharmic side is karma reincarnation? And I present that to people on the Christian side. Will they be willing to accept karma reincarnation? And the answer is no, because it has an inherent conflict with the idea of original sin and so on and so forth. And so that is the kind of difference I wanted to discover. So it was a long time to discover this through trial and error. It was discovery through trial and error and living these debates all the time. And what crystallized the notion of history centrism, I had presented it in the late 90s several times, but what made it very poignant for me was after 9/11, the US government decided to sensitize senior officials to various religious traditions. So there was a seminar on Islam, and there would be a seminar on Confucian thought, or a seminar on Buddhism. So I was asked to give a seminar on Hinduism to the huge auditorium filled with senior government officials. And I started by asking a question rather than presenting anything. I just wanted to ask questions and have an interaction. Because they're all very smart, educated, rational people. And Judeo-Christian people. So I asked the question, what would happen if all history were lost? What would happen if all history were lost? Could you be a religious person? Could you do something that we call sadhana, but not know all the historical details of what happened somewhere? And the responses were absolutely amazing. These are educated, mainstream people. And the general view, to paraphrase, was that we'd be in darkness because the infinite gap between God and man is not something we can just, figure out for ourselves, because there are limits to the mind. But what they hadn't thought of is that you can transcend this mind. See? So they were appreciative of the limits to the mind, which we also appreciate. That's where they were, because they haven't had the yoga. So, since we cannot fathom everything, there's limits to the mind. Therefore, the ultimate reality and the ultimate truth would never be known to us, and we'd be in darkness. And we become sort of mental creatures, never able to know the ultimate reality. God has sent prophets with that ultimate reality. And that happened in history. So the historicity of who these prophets were, what they said, where they were, is absolutely necessary condition for us to know that truth. So that became the idea of history centrism. A sort of dependence on a history, almost a bondage to that history, such that if somebody says he knows some truth, but he doesn't discounts or dismisses all this history, then you have to really take him to task, because there's no way he could have found it. So I continued this exchange, continued saying, but how, what if you were born in an island? What if you're born in an island and we're not educated, nobody taught us any history, nobody had taught us Bible or anything like that? What happens to us? What happens to us who just, for no fault of our own, don't have that history? And the answer is very clear, that you cannot go beyond a certain stage. You could live a virtuous life and there are good things you can do, but the ultimate redemption happens through that unique historical event. And so, if I push too much with smaller groups, they would even come to the stage of asking me, how dare you take my history from me? Or who are you to take this from me? That kind of thing. So almost to the point of rebellion. Then there was a grant proposal from Cornell University. They wanted to have a world conference on religious harmony and religious conflict. And they asked me for the grant. So I got involved in the thought process. And I found that basically their plan was that religious leaders would come and condemn whoever is their opponent. So Tibetans would condemn Chinese as their opponent, and some place where Christians are being persecuted, they would blame somebody like that. So I decided that we should also have accountability on the religion side. I mean, we should decide what are some of the sources of conflict. And I identified history centrism. I said that the clash of civilizations is a history-centric clash, because Islam is very history-centric, and you put side by side the history-centric claims of Christianity and Islam. For one to be valid, the other has to be invalidated. This works in both directions. And so the only way you can remove this disharmony is to question the history-centrism. This is what I thought should be the case. I thought this was a good breakthrough. They would love this idea. And they said, so this person who was in charge of this head of religion at Cornell, who was going to do this conference, went back to the various religious heads, and they wanted to know why does he think that there is history-related issue? So I picked on the status of Jesus in Christianity is different than the status of Jesus in Islam. And the two cannot be reconciled. Because in Christianity, it is not enough that he's a prophet or a rishi or a guru, he has to be son of God. And the reason he has to be son of God is because original sin, which was caused by Adam and Eve, results in God giving all progeny of Adam and Eve a curse of eternal damnation. So this means that the karma of Adam and Eve is infecting all their progeny, sort of like sexually transmitted karmic consequence to all their progeny. And therefore we're all born sinners. That's why it's a common phrase. People will say, you're all born sinners, we have to be redeemed. And then God wants to solve this problem, and the way he can solve the problem is to incarnate, or have his son incarnate and suffer for everybody else. So that, and that is called redemption. The crucifixion gives rise to the possibility of redemption, but people have to then believe in this sacrifice, this historical event, in order to get the benefit of redemption. And virgin birth is necessary. A lot of people don't know why virgin birth is such a big deal. It is a big deal. Because if Jesus did not have a virgin birth, if Jesus was born of a human father and a human mother, then he would be progeny of Adam and Eve. And then he would be born a sinner. So he has to be born without being a sinner, and hence not progeny of Adam and Eve. Therefore, there is no human father, and it's a virgin birth, and therefore he's not a sinner. Yeah. Now, so if you look at the axioms, everything else is very logical. There's internal consistency within all these systems. Internal consistency. So you cannot say one of them is false because it is true according to its axioms. Another one is true according to its axioms. So all you can do is contrast one set of axioms with another set of axioms, and then it's a matter of what you want to choose. Now in Islam, Jesus is highly revered as a great prophet, but not as Son of God. Not as Son of God. And there's a reason for that. The Son of God could not be superseded by a mortal prophet. A mortal prophet. And since Muhammad is not Son of God, but a mortal prophet, he cannot supersede, and so whatever he says, he can be a nice guy, but the original revelation in the New Testament prevails, and the Quran cannot supersede it. But the Quran must supersede it, otherwise there's no sense in having Islam. So the only way the Quran can supersede is if Jesus is brought to the status of prophet. Then a prophet can be superseded by another prophet. So Islam cannot accept Son of God. Now take this back to the Christian and say, okay, we love him as a prophet, but no Son of God and all that stuff. And it's no deal. So you have a history-centric axiom and another history-centric axiom, and they are irreconcilable. And if you want to know another example like this, the book of Revelation says that Jesus will come back when the kingdom of David has been restored. The original Israel has been restored. Then he'll come back and all the evil will be gone, and the final day of judgment, and there'll be happiness and all that stuff. Okay. Now, the prerequisites for Jesus to come back are restoration of the kingdom of Israel, including and especially the temple of David, which is the center of the kingdom of Israel. But guess the site of that temple of David is what today? It's a mosque, and not an ordinary mosque, but the place from which Muhammad went to paradise. So taking that mosque over and rebuilding the temple of David is a prerequisite of one camp for the extraordinary event to happen. And of course it's not going to be possible for the other camp to accept it. So this is when history centrism is so rigid and becomes non-negotiable. So I found, when I gave these proposals to these guys, I said, are you willing to at least discuss and debate the history centrism as a factor? What came back is that Mary Jane Law was a professor in Cornell doing this, very good friend, Buddhist practitioner herself. Very innocently and naively, she was very impressed by this, and she proposed it to all the religious leaders. What came back was a lot of anger at her, because she thought she proposed it as a good idea. And what came back is, who are you to tamper with our text and our history, and we're calling it history-centric and all that. We are history-centric, but we're not authorized to change any of this. So then my counter-proposal, because I really wanted that conference to happen, my counter-proposal was, we are not going to remove the history-centric verses from any text. We're merely going to have a resolution that we should stop teaching those things which are history-centric and that conflict with other history-centric. So then if you deactivate it and don't teach it for maybe 20 years, maybe the rest of it can be harmonized. And it came back, no deal. So we withdrew that event, that conference never even happened. So all these, I've had many such experiences. It's easy to say, well, most Westerners are not history-centric. The point is that when you really start scratching the surface and giving a strategic trade-off, you find that giving up the historical identity of being a Westerner is not very easy for most people. And those who are not religious still have a sense of historical greatness. It's called American exceptionalism. That's the term Americans are very proud of. And in this new election season, both the right-wing camp and the left-wing camp are saying we have to restore our American exceptionalism. Yeah? So you find liberals talking about it. It's not just the religious right talking about it. So the Hegelian idea of the West as the kind of model of a wagon or a train, and the engine or horses that are pulling it are the West, and all the other civilizations are at the back being kind of pulled along. So the message that he made very clear, and I do a very deep critique of Hegel in this book, very good, because it's not Judeo-Christianity I'm after, it's mainly Hegelianism, because that's what Ken Wilber sees he's a successor to Hegel. So I have to build that foundation for other volumes. So Hegel's idea that other countries, other civilizations are the way we the West used to be. So your present, he tells other civilizations, your present state is like our past. And our present state is your future. So it means you have to become like us. And so he justifies colonialism as a wonderful project to help the colonized people become like us. Sort of like children being raised to be like us. And justifies that those who will not comply can be and should be genocided, because the whole train, the whole wagon could be threatened. So he comes to the conclusion, and he makes statements, I've quoted here, that Native Americans being exterminated is fine, because they're coming in the path of civilization's progress. And the enslavement of Africans is fine, because they're very dangerous, otherwise they need to be controlled. But China and India are lucky that they don't have to be enslaved or genocided, because they have the potential to be civilized. But that potential can be only achieved if the West has a trusteeship over them, and that's what the colonialism is for. So he gives a very logical justification of that. So that's where history centrism leads. And the dharmic alternative is that rather than the infinite gap between God and man, we are the manifestation of the divine, which I don't have to tell the 3 or billion people. And so the Satchitanand potential is always there in everyone. And even if all history were lost, it can be regained, because new rishis will come. 1 in a trillion maybe, or 1 in a billion, or whatever, 10 billion, and maybe it'll take every 100 years to, if all history were lost, the point is, it's a matter of time before some rishi will come again. And so there is no big trauma and dependency and obsessiveness of being history-centric. And that comes from an alternative set of axioms. Axiom being that our self is not fallen sinner, but Satchitananda. That's our ultimate, that's our real self. And so the idea of self-empowerment, self-actualization, self-realization, evolution of consciousness is very natural. And hence such a civilization would keep evolving and experimenting with yoga and meditation and different kinds of sadhanas. Therefore, I put this in chapter 2, which is the first big contrast. I put this history-centrism versus Adhyatma Vidya as two different modes of knowledge. And I found that whenever I've had a discussion with theologians, Christian theologians, it really ends up as or when you watch television and see a sermon going on, it's not philosophical, it's a history lesson. It's a history lesson. So-and-so said this, then he said that, then he did this, then he did that. It's a kind of a history lesson which is required for people to lead the right kind of life. So the chapter after that, which should actually come for this audience, should come before, is where I differentiate integral unity and synthetic unity. Because the point I make is that the integral unity, which is Brahman-based, Brahman as the integral unity. And Sri Aurobindo does a marvelous job of explaining that there is nothing except this one integral unity. I've just given the term integral unity, but it's actually Sri Aurobindo's idea. And this is the basis of the evolution, this is the basis of us being the same as the divine in terms of essence, and the idea of Satchitanand, and the idea that even with the loss of history we can regain it and we can evolve it. All of that comes from the basic principles of integral unity. So if I were to contrast philosophy with philosophy, I would say integral unity is the thing I'm defending the most. That's the system of thought I'm defending the most. And on the other side, to contrast against integral unity, I have coined the term synthetic unity. To give a simple view of what these are, integral unity is where the parts that comprise a unified whole do not exist separately. They are, first there is one, and the parts exist only relative to the one, and not in of themselves. On the other hand, in the synthetic unity, an example is, several examples I give in the book. So if you look at an automobile, the people who put it together are putting together parts that are pre-existing. So a tire is made somewhere, battery is made somewhere, paint is made somewhere. And these parts have their own separate existence and their separate origin, and they're put together. So that's a synthetic unity, when the parts are put together. The G20 is a synthetic unity because all the sovereign nations that are part of it, and the United Nations is synthetic unity, and the coalition government, which has several parties, is synthetic unity. Because the separate parts, each got their own separate agenda, ego, existence, which they are protecting and projecting forward. And the idea, the agenda of the unity is secondary. The unity, the UN is a vehicle for my country to get its step forward. G20 is a vehicle for my country to improve its situation better. So it is not like the G20 comes first and then all the parts are carrying out what G20 is all about. It's not like that. So there are plenty of examples from physical objects and social entities as commonly perceived. Ultimately we know they're all integral unified, but a cognition of that these are synthetic unity would be when the parts exist separately. Now, the synthetic unity of the Judeo-Christian idea of that has prevailed. There were other mystical ideas which did not become as important. They existed. There are certainly mystics who said similar things, yes, integral unity. But what dominated, what survived, what took control in the historicity, in the historical trajectory, because of the church and its need for control and power, are synthetic entities. So there's God, there's souls that are separate. God, soul, and world are separate entities. And the quest is to figure out what's the relationship between man and God, this sort of thing. And not that in the beginning there is this, that we are in fact God. An interesting question is, for a Christian to ask is, does he see that he is in fact Jesus? That he is in fact Christ? And that if the historicity were gone, it wouldn't really matter too much to him because he has that potential in himself. And that's a good test to ask, you know. And some people would say yes, and a lot of them would say no. But I think the reason I'm doing this work is to sharpen these issues, so that it sharpens the introspection. Now, in the case of Greek thought, which is also part of the West in a very big way, Aristotle came up with the law of the excluded middle, which said something can be true or false, binary, yes, no, the whole word, yes, no, with no middle, law of the excluded middle. Whereas in the Dharmic traditions and in modern, quantum physics and many other kind of things, you have uncertainty, you have yes or no. In Jain logic, you have yes, no, neither yes nor no, both yes and no. You have all those possibilities. It's not the law of the excluded middle. So you have a synthetic unity in the Hebraic tradition, which is Judeo-Christianity, and you have a synthetic unity built into through Aristotle in the Hellenistic tradition, which is Greek thought. And then you have these two synthetic traditions synthesized with each other. That is what St. Augustine did. He took the Bible and brought in Greek thought. I have almost a whole chapter on how Hebraic thought and Greek thought are fused together to create theology. I mean, St. Augustine is considered by church historians as the first theologian. That's the beginning of theology, the first real theologian, philosophical. And it is very explicitly stated that he was able to create theology by borrowing from Greek thought. So that's like a U-turn, because you take Greek thought, you separate out their religion, call it pagan, denounce it, finish it off. But you need their reason. So you separate the reason from the rest of their civilization, you take what you need and fits, and you reject what doesn't fit. And that fusion is a synthesis of Hebraic and Hellenistic. And I maintain and argue in this book that this fusion of revelation and reason has still not been resolved. Hence the debates going on between science and religion. Hence Templeton Foundation has to spend billions of dollars on conferences and scholarship and research on merging science and religion. So the mere fact that there's an exercise to merge A and B shows that there's a problem. Otherwise you wouldn't need such an exercise, and you wouldn't need such a heavy-duty program to bring things together if they were always there. And the history of conflicts is very well known, the whole history of conflicts between the camp of religion and science. And then a truce is declared which says that you have one domain in which you are the king and the other domain in which we rule, and so hence the separation of church and state and so on, to declare a tentative peace. And now a kind of a new movement to bring the two together is going on. It's to be encouraged. It's a great movement, but I don't think it has done its job yet, because you have all these fights between creationism and evolution. You have all these fights between, basically the science camp and religion camp very seriously in the United States. And when I say West, I just want to be clear. I'm referring mainly to the United States because that's where my reference point is. Maybe much of this doesn't apply to Europe. That's fair enough. I mean, I'm not studying Europe as much, but United States. So this synthetic unity of biblical parts comprising reality and the law of excluded middle in Aristotelian thought, saying that wholes are composites of parts. Parts exist, essences exist separately, and then wholes are created. And then these two worldviews are then further synthesized into what becomes the West, The West becomes a fusion of the Hebraic and the Hellenistic. And then so many other civilizations are conquered, colonized, and what is useful about them is synthesized. So a lot of Native American stuff gets put into Western civilization. A lot of African things, a lot of pagan ideas which are rejected from Christianity, but those ideas, like some of the rituals, some of the Christmas tree and Easter and all that, are from the very pagans who are finished off. So something is useful that is brought in, and the rest of it is let go. So the West is a composite civilization, because it hasn't been built on the Brahman kind of integral unity to begin with. And so the reason I mention all this is that people like Wilbur are basically taking an integral unity and remapping it into a synthetic framework. So that is a violence. You're taking something and in a reductionist lens, because he wants to map that this came from Kant and this came from Hegel and this could have been extrapolated out of there. So he wants to substitute Western historical pioneers to let go of the Indian ones. That's his program. And since these Western historical pioneers got unified in a synthetic way to begin with, what he's doing is destroying a synthetic unity and replacing it with, an integral unity and replacing it with a synthetic one. That's my problem. So while his movement is called the integral movement, it is a synthetic movement. And I'm toying with titles of my book, like, the synthetic Wilbur, kind of, to really make that point and start a debate. And I'd love to have a debate with you. So, another difference mentioned, I think it's chapter 4. That chapter is called Order and Chaos. Now this chapter is the result of a whole lot of observations I made in my watching Westerners, watching Indians. So for instance, in my corporate life, if there was a project meeting where there would be some Indians, some Westerners, and they're discussing some project, the Indians are all simultaneously having many conversations. A is talking to B, C is talking to D, and E is talking to both of them, and all kind of things happening. And Westerners are not comfortable with it. They would rather have one thing at a time, linear. So typically when such a meeting is over, everybody goes. Some Westerners come to me and say, we don't know what happened. We're confused. We cannot make head or tail of what we're supposed to do. So my job would be, as the project leader, to sort of redo the whole meeting in a linear, systematic way. While none of the Indians would come back chaos and confused. They would sort of filter out multi-thread, multi-parallel processing, figure it out. So I realized that there's an issue here when you have cross-cultural teams. You have to make sure everybody knows what's going on. So I would have one free brainstorm mode. And then before concluding, I would say, now for the benefit of some people, we're going to sit down and make a linear list, like step 1, 2, 3, like that kind of thing, And I found this is quite a common characteristic. The Indians' ability to do a lot of things at once, handle immense amount of complexity, ambiguity, uncertainty, contradiction, what appears contradiction, simultaneously, what the Westerners would call chaos. But this paradigm and this vocabulary, and I really appreciated that Anand picked out the fact that having crystal clear vocabulary is very important. It clarifies, it sharpens issues. So this idea that discomfort with chaos of the West is a differentiating point, and I need to figure out where does it come from. And it comes from the synthetic unity, fear of falling apart. Whereas the integral unity cannot fall apart, because there is nothing to fall apart. The parts are not separate anyway. So the cosmos and the nature of reality and the nature of being, there is no such thing as it will fall apart and there will be chaos. In the West, in the whole tradition, the worst thing that can happen is chaos. Chaos. It's sort of satanic, immoral. Chaos is immoral in the Bible. Satanic realm is disorderly. Eden is very organized, orderly, straight lines, like Manhattan, straight lines, kind of thing. So this became very poignant in my mind, this thing, when I attended the Kumbh Mela. Kumbh Mela is huge. There's no event manager, there's no schedule, there's no headquarters that says we control this flow of events. It's like self-organized, decentralized by hundreds and thousands of groups that through astronomical, I guess the astronomical clock is an organizing principle, and they all know at this point we got to show up at this place, and they all do it, put up their tents, and everybody's doing their thing. So I was the invited guest of Swami Abdeshanand Giri, who is the head of the Juna Akhada. Juna Akhada is the one that has all the Naga sadhus, the ones who don't wear clothes or go bathe, So he was the head of that. So he invited me. I felt so delighted that I'm going to really have the experience. So I stayed at his guest. And on the special day of bathing, I went there and I went with them. And it was very exciting. So after the event was over, I had my taxi waiting out. I was packed and ready to go. And came in banking with my host. There was an American documentary crew, TV crew from ABC News, ABC crew. There's a show called Sunday Morning. So they were there. And they were interviewing different people about Kumbh Mela. So they were interviewing the head of this whole Naga group. He speaks fluent English. They were asking him questions. So I just went there to say my goodbye, and he said, no, wait a minute. And he told these group people, why don't you interview Rajiv also? He'll have something interesting to say. He comes from US, and maybe you can ask him all these questions you're asking me. So these people said, would you mind waiting 5 minutes? We just have a question to ask you. I said, fine. Now that 5 minutes turned out to be 3 hours, because it just went into really detailed conversation. It was very interesting for me. And when the show was broadcast, most of the thing was my interview, much of it. But of course, they only put out a small part of the whole footage. The question they asked me was very interesting. He said, we've been here for a month, the whole crew. They're a huge band, crew, and a lot of stuff, And we've been here a month, and we've been asking everybody, how do we explain all this chaos to the Americans back home? That was his question. How do you explain all this chaos to the Americans back home? So what would you say? So I said, the Americans have a certain threshold of cognitive complexity which they can deal with. If the cognitive complexity is too much, too many things happening, and too many things that are not codified and not within the norms, predictable, organized into boxes and categories, then that's cognitive overload. And the cognitive system of the Westerner crashes. It's a system crash. And that system crash is called chaos. So the chaos is in your mind. It's not out there. It's how you're cognizing what's out there. And it's your inability to take it comfortably. And your fixation with order. Order means control, rules, all of that predictable stuff. It's your inability to be relaxed in this way, what's out there. Because it's far too complex, it's far too fluid, it's far too massive for you. That inability and the fear that your cognitive system is crashing is the experience of chaos the Westerner has. But it's not that there's chaos. You're experiencing it as chaos. I said, if you go around, you will find there's one guy walking and he's not feeling chaotic, that somebody else doing something, somebody's eating, somebody's taking a bath, everybody's doing something. And they're quite relaxed about it. They don't feel there's some chaos. But you are looking at the whole thing and trying to fit it into some preconceived idea of what such a thing, what such an event should be. And since it doesn't fit, you're calling it chaos. So since then I started thinking of things in this order versus chaos kind of mode. And then I realized in this Order and Chaos chapter, it talks about how some of the pioneers of quantum physics were inspired by dharmic texts to understand the nature of uncertainty, and how the cover of the book, when you see it, has got the churning of the ocean, Samudra Manthan image, devas and asuras and the spindle, the deity, the spine of the book, to show that there hasn't been this philosophy that chaos is evil, has to be exterminated, finished forever. Whereas in the biblical sense, the ultimate is the all evil, all Satan, all chaos, all of that will be exterminated forever, finished. In the Indian story, the devas and asuras never annihilate each other, nor is there a plan that the asuras will be gone forever, because it has to do with cyclical time also. It has to do with things, things are in balance. So the idea that this business of asura is evil, Satan, external, isn't there. It's internal, it's also part of me. I keep them in balance. It's also a creative resource. Uncertainty and so-called chaos is a creative resource that you can use for creating new ideas. So, the Indian texts want order to override over chaos, but not that chaos will be finished and annihilated. It's there. You don't want it to take over, but it's there. It's got its place in the cosmos. So this is an interesting point, because an American historian validated this point. It was just sort of like a speculative thought of mine. But then I read a historian called Andrew Rotter, who wrote a book on American attitudes towards South Asia, political attitudes and policies towards South Asia during the Nixon era and Kennedy and Johnson era. He got some declassified CIA and US government documents in which the president and the vice president and the head of CIA and the State Department, they're all talking to each other in secret memos. And there he finds, and he's written a whole book on this, that India represented uncertainty, unpredictability, disorder, therefore an unreliable ally. Words like having millions of gods means moral ambiguity, moral relativism. How do you trust a person who doesn't know that there is one truth? Can you really have an ally? I mean, this is very interesting that top government thinkers have internalized this idea of a chaotic India all the way into policy making. And their attitude on Pakistan, because Ayub Khan was the president, the general, he wears proper uniform, and when he drinks his double scotch, he knows what he's doing. There's no uncertainty. And when you see his polo game or golf game, he's a man of stature, and he's tall, and he's solid kind of a guy. And their religious ideology is of one truth, one God. Maybe their truth is not correct, but still it is certain. An ally who got it wrong, but who is certain, is more reliable, because you can predict him, than an ally who may sometimes agree with you, sometimes disagree with you, but at the rock bottom, you don't know where he stands, because he's got all these multiple truths and ambiguities and all this chaos. This is a book on this that I can refer to in my book. So that was a very interesting validation of fear of chaos. And fear of chaos not just in the biblical realm, but also in the geopolitical realm today. And you see a lot of National Geographic phrases and anthropologists' writings and travelogues of chaotic streets and swarming people like ant hills. So this Rotter quotes all that. He says that these are some of the common phrases Westerners have when they talk about India and their experience of India. So this has to do with this difference about the nature of chaos and whether it's something to be fearful or whether it's just part of reality. And I bring it down to the absence of an integral unity. Because if you do not have an integral unity, you're always afraid things will fall apart. Because you have a synthetic unity. And things do fall apart. Like in the 60s, there's a crisis of myth. Crisis of myth because there's Vietnam War, and there is Watergate, and there is civil rights. And so this whole business of American exceptionalism, which is a very unified myth, falls apart. People have doubts. Some of them come to India, some of them go to drugs, they do all kinds of things. And so then of course that period is over and the new myth is created of great America, great prosperity, post-Soviet era of great things happening. And today there's another crisis of myth in America. Crisis of American myth is happening right now. Young people are very, sort of in a state of things have fallen apart. And what's our future? Some of them are looking again to India, like in the 60s they did. So there's reigniting the interest in India happening now, again, for a second time. I see that happening. So the synthetic unity is always vulnerable to artificial means to keep order together, to keep the synthesis glued together, because of the fear that it will fall apart. And this can go to extremes of violence and external projections of military conquests as a way of keeping things together. So the West, I show in this book, the West has a history, and I show many major milestones, has a history of externalizing this fear, thinking that, okay, if I capture enough, if I expand enough, if I bring enough parts and stick them with me, then maybe I will achieve the unity I'm looking for. But the flaw in this model is that it hasn't started with integral unity to begin with. And no amount of synthesis, no amount of parts that you can beg, borrow, steal, plunder, and how solidly you glue them will create an integral unity. It's a flawed model to begin with. And that's the basis of my whole critique of Wilbur, because he is basically taking all the parts from here, there, wherever he can get them from, and sticking them together into a new kind of a model. So that's my thing. Now, the final difference in this book is chapter 5, which is called Sanskrit Non-Translatables. And that discusses how the Indian difference, how certain things about Dharmic civilization are preserved in certain words which have no equivalent. And I give about 20 examples. And there's many, many more. And I appreciate the help of Sampaji in helping me in clarifying some of these words and their meanings. The translation of a Sanskrit word, which is the result of very unique cosmology and integral unity and a lot of experience of that unity, translating it to an English word which is not got the same backing, the same background, does violence to this word. It sort of distorts its meaning. So my proposal is that certain Sanskrit words should be just made part of the English language. We just bring them. It's like yoga is yoga, thankfully. It's not exercise, gymnastics, prayer. It's yoga. It's not none of those things. And if the word dosa were replaced with pancakes or something, then in a generation or two, they'd be selling pancakes and spray some coconut on it or something and say, okay, that's dosa. I mean, the separation of a word keeps the referent, what you're referring to, also preserved. And if this word is lost, then over a period of time, what it refers to is also lost. People don't know that it's something different. Because the new Western word, replacing it, seems to have so much currency, so much popularity. Very few people nowadays have the time to go dig deep and understand what it might have meant. I also disagree with people who say that we appropriate the Western word and reinterpret it our way. Because this Western word has got such a long history. There's such a lot of, so many people, for every 10 people on the Dharma side using it, there's 10,000 people who've used it in a different way. So we are contesting that word as an outsider, and it's probably a better idea to just preserve the Sanskrit word. The English language has a sort of, it's going to dominate. I accept that. It's unfortunate, but I accept that. But I think in the English language, like the Germans have brought in a few words, French have brought in a few words, we can certainly bring in 50 or 100 very key philosophical Sanskrit words and keep them non-translatable, and that preserves our distinctiveness. The final concept I will mention, and then I will stop, because I think it was wonderful to get many people's comments. I have a concept in this book called being digested. Being digested is like one civilization gets digested into another, and it ceases to exist as its own separate thing. So the tiger eats and digests a deer. The result is a strong tiger. The deer is gone, and there is no deer DNA left. Not one copy of the DNA molecule of the deer lives in the tiger, because it will be toxic, it will be alien, it cannot be tolerated. So the deer has been broken down into little parts through the digestive tract, and the enzymes come and all that, until there is no more DNA of the deer left, and it's broken into raw material. Then they are reassembled into tiger DNA and put in all over its body, and it's strong and healthy. So what is not digestible is either left out or excreted as waste. So civilizations have been digested, and you can see them in museums. The Egyptian, the Native American, large parts of many kinds of civilizations that live in museums. And so I am also doing a project on how these U-turns have a cumulative effect over time of getting digested. If Wilbur has his way, then in 10 years, 20 years, there'll be no sense, no reason to study Sri Aurobindo at all, because with his might and his clout and his power, there'll be this Wilburism taught everywhere. Some people in Pondy are starting to teach it. He's becoming more popular in Aurobindo. I'll see how the Aurobindians react to this afternoon. But there's a whole lot of Wilbur fan club, and they've taken over several institutions in the US, Michael Murphy's SLM, which was started with a huge amount of experimental work on Dharmic civilizations in the 60s and 70s. It's sort of, kind of a strategic alliance with Wilbur. So over a period of time, it'll be considered like, Sri Aurobindo is too complex. Why do you want to go into all those old things? We have it easier, and we have it more modern. We have more money, grants we can give to conferences and books, and we can. So in other words, there's partly material power, political power, partly it's more fashionable, partly it's more sort of simpler to understand. And over a period of time, if things continue this way, then a time will come when very few scholars will be left who really want to study Sri Aurobindo, and it will be much more fashionable, much easier to get a job if there'll be a chair of Wilbur studies in various universities. They already started that. And so that will digest. So that's an example of a worldview, an integral worldview getting digested into an alternative system which ironically is not integral. And it's that part which bothers me, that it's not integral. So the integrality gets digested into a synthetic unity as another ornament, and then they can have one picture somewhere in their hall somewhere saying, yeah, he's one of the Eastern wisdom guys of the past. That sort of thing. So this business of being digested is what drives this U-turn series. And the antidote to being digested is being different. We're either being digested or we're being different. If we are different, that means something not digestible we have to discover. And that's what I've tried to do. Something which will give them indigestion if they were to eat it. So instead of being the deer, some people say, well, why don't we also be a tiger and fight them as a tiger? And I say no, because then you lost your selfhood. So a tiger doesn't fight. We don't want to become a tiger to survive. There's an alternative metaphor, and that's the porcupine, who is non-violent, ahimsa. But if the tiger eats him, the tiger will die, because he's got poison in his quills. So it's a non-violent way of protecting himself by saying, I have poison for you if you want to digest me, so I'm indigestible to the extent of harming you if you were to try that. But it's not that I'm aggressive and trying to kill you. It's if you are aggressive, you would face that consequence. So I'm also in the next volume developing some poison pills. And some poison pills are things that when the Western U-turner accepts and internalizes part of sadhana, certain parts of sadhana, that as long as he doesn't cut that out like Jung did, it will work over a period of time and his history-centrism will go away and liberate it. So the poison pill is a good thing. It's not a negative poison pill. It's a poison pill of the ego, of the Western ego, the historic history-centric ego. And so I'm identifying what are these poison pills that we should not let go. We should not translate them into something else. They are non-translatables. And once these poison pills are taken in by the person, then he cannot just continue being the tiger. Then he has stopped being the tiger. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll have a discussion.
Well, thank you, Rajiv. I think I'll not stop now. We'll have a short break for tea, another 20 minutes. It's 10 to 11, so 11:20 we'll be back here. Then the discussions will start, right?